This is Bilal, your economic instructor. Today we'll be solving some MCQs for the chapter Consumer and Producer Surplus. It's a complicated concept, therefore, let's get started. At first, television service were available at no charges. The television company then charges viewers 6 per hour to watch programs. The demand curve is D. Okay. Now, initially, this entire area was my consumer surplus, the one shaded with the red, the entire triangle. Now, the consumer surplus is 6 and above. Only the triangle is my consumer surplus. Let's look at the options. What is the value of consumer loss in the consumer surplus, and what value of consumer surplus remains after the introduction of hourly charges? Now, initially there were 5,000 multiplied by 10 multiplied by half. Because we need to calculate the area of rectangle. So that would be 50,000 half, which is 25,000. Currently, it is 2,000 multiplied by 4, length into breadth, and then half. So this gives me what? 4,000, 8,000, and then 4,000, right? So the loss in consumer surplus is 21,000. The answer would be C or D. And the remaining consumer surplus is 4,000. So the answer is C, right? Moving on to the next MCQ. The diagram shows the European airline market. Okay. New entrants have come into the market, shifting the supply from S1 to S2. Okay. Which area represents the new producer surplus? So initially, the producer surplus would have been GM all the way to J. So this entire triangle is my producer surplus. Now the new consumer surplus would be HN all the way down to K. So H, N, and K. So C is the right answer. Now this concept is different from taxes. So you don't need to confuse them, because taxes, when we're calculating taxes, that area basically goes to the government. So we don't need to confuse both the concepts, right? The diagram shows the demand and supply curve for a product. Which area represents the producer surplus? Okay, now we know that this area is the producer surplus. And the examiner will not might ask such simple questions as well. But in this MCQ, it's a bit different, right? So let's look at the options. O, W, Y, and Z. So O, W, Y, and Z minus O, W, and Y. Minus O, W, and Y. So we have this entire shaded area remaining. As you can see, it is the same as the producer surplus, right? This area 1 and this area 2 is the same. So if I deduct one area, the remaining area is automatically my producer surplus in terms of value, right? So this is just a tricky way of asking this MCQ. Now let's look at the other options, OWY minus OYZ. Well, this is a better answer to that. Now, basically what this is saying, I'll just repeat the points so that it's easier for you people to understand. O, W, Y, Z. So this is the entire rectangle. I'll just shade this so it's easy for you people to understand. This entire area minus O, Y, and Z. So if I deduct O, Y, and Z, which means this area, the only area that is now remaining is my producer surplus. Well, this is the right answer. However, if B was not given, A would also have been the right answer, because OWY is equal to O, Y, and Z. So basically, according to maths, if I make this line, this rectangle, this triangle A is equal to triangle B. So that's the concept, right? So B is correct. O, X, Y, Z. Now O, X, Y, Z. Now this is incorrect because O, X, Y, X is basically above the price, therefore it cannot be the right answer, right? So C and D are incorrect. In the diagram, D is a country. In the diagram, D is a country's demand curve for an imported good. The country's government imposes import tariff equal to PW to PC on a good. Now, the tariff has been imposed. Which area measures the resulting loss in consumer surplus and the gain in government revenue? Now, if this is the tax, let me just include the supply curves, S1, right? Now, the tax is this area. The consumer surplus initially was this entire triangle, which includes X and Y, right? And now the consumer surplus is just this area, which I am highlighting by the color red. So how much consumer surplus did we lose? We lost the area X plus Y. So the answer would be either A or B. What is the gain in government revenue? How much did the government get in taxes? So it's saying this is the tax. So if this is the tax, this entire area is my tax revenue, right? So X would be my tax revenue. A is my right answer. 5. What is necessary for consumer surplus to be zero? So if consumer surplus is zero, this basically means what people are willing to pay and actually paying are the same. So if the demand is perfectly elastic, all right. If the demand is perfectly inelastic, this is my supply curve. So if this is supposedly the price, anything above is my consumer surplus. So there will be a consumer surplus, right? But if the demand is perfectly inelastic, and this is my supply curve, now the consumer surplus cannot be above the demand curve. The demand curve is a boundary, right? So this is the price, and above the price is my consumer surplus, but the demand curve is restricting the consumer surplus to go upwards. Therefore, in this case, there is no consumer surplus when the demand is perfectly elastic, right? A is the right answer. 6. The government decides to issue cards for residents that give 50% reduction on entry prices for visits to local museum. The diagram shows the demand curve for a resident who currently makes 3 museum visits. All right. Now, what would be the change in the resident's consumer surplus when the card is issued? Okay. Now, initially, he's making 2 visits, which means for 3, the price is 2, and the consumer surplus is W. Now, if the card is issued, we'll have a 50% reduction, as this question states. The price would now be 1, and my consumer surplus will be this entire red area, the triangle in red. So the consumer surplus will change by the area X plus Y. It will increase by the area X plus Y. Z is just given for confusion. W was the initial consumer surplus. And if the question had asked what is the total consumer surplus, our answer would be WX plus Y. As simple as that. The diagram shows an European airline market. The original demand curve is D1 and the original supply curve is S1. There is an increase in the demand for air travel. Now, the earlier question had increase in supply. Now, this is basically increase in demand, right? So initially, which area shows the consumer and producer surplus at the neo equilibrium? So we'll just look at the neo equilibrium. H, M, F. This is my consumer surplus, H, M, and F, H, M, and F. So A and B are the right answers. And my producer surplus would be H, M, and J. So H, M, and J. Hence, A is the right answer, right? Moving on. What does consumer surplus means? It means what the customer is willing to pay minus what he actually pays. So excess profit earned by producers, that has something to do with producer surplus, not consumer surplus. Opportunity cost to the consumer of not buying the good, well, it is not that. The price of marginal consumer is willing to pay for a good. An addition, what marginal consumer means, basically, it means one additional consumer. The price what an additional consumer is willing to pay for the good minus what he actually pays would be the complete definition. So C is incorrect. The consumer gains from purchasing good at a price below what they're willing to pay. Now, this is the right answer. Okay, now here comes a tricky one. D1 and S1 represent the initial demand curve. So D1, oops, D1 and S1. D2, S2 are equivalent curves after changes in the market condition. Now it is D2 and S2. Okay. What are the resulting changes in consumer and producer surplus? So initially, the equilibrium was this. The consumer surplus was R and T, and it's now P. The consumer surplus, because above the equilibrium price is my consumer surplus, right? So R to R plus T was my consumer surplus earlier. Now it's only P. So the answer would be B or C. And producer surplus was U. Now it is Q. So it has changed from U to Q. Oh, it's U, Q, and you can look at this area as well. It also includes R. So initially it was just U. Now it's Q plus R. So B is my supposedly right answer. Now it would be better if you can print it out and shade it. The entire concept would be extremely clear then.
Okay, so let's move on to the 11th MCQ. There are 10,000 tickets available to watch a sport at a final national stadium. The initial ticket price is $20. The government decides to fix an effective minimum price for the tickets. Under which condition would the consumer surplus for the tickets decrease the most as a result of the minimum price? Okay, now the equilibrium price is 20, right? And it's an effective minimum price. So minimum price are supposed to be above the equilibrium. So we get to know the answer is either C or D, right? Now let's look at a concept for elasticities. Now let's say this is my normal supply curve, dollar quantity. And let's say that this is my demand curve, which is basically elastic, right? And let me make another graph in this concept where I keep my demand inelastic, all right? Okay. Now the red line is basically inelastic demand, DI, and DE is basically the elastic demand, right? So we need to look at the consumer surplus. For elastic demand, the consumer surplus is this highlighted area, right? And for inelastic demand, it is the entire blue highlighted area, yellow highlighted area, sorry. So we know that we have more consumer surplus when the demand is inelastic. So if a minimum price is imposed, more consumer surplus would be lost if the demand were to be inelastic. So what do you mean by this? Let me just give you an example. I will make a minimum price to show you, right? So now let's say that this is the minimum price, right? If this is the minimum price, let me just label the areas 1 and this area is 2, right? So for the elastic demand curve, we lost a consumer surplus equal to the area 1. And for inelastic demand curve, we lost the area equal to 1 plus 2. So when the demand curve is inelastic, the consumer surplus is greater. And when we increase the prices, we lose more of consumer surplus when the demand is inelastic. It's basically saying a person that has more will lose more if there is a loss. A person who has less will lose less. So that's basically what it's trying to explain. Now, the last MCQ, oops, right. A country has a healthcare provided by free market and this is replaced by government provision of SG free healthcare. So the government can only provide this many units of free healthcare. Initially it was a free market, so SG was not there. The only thing that was there was demand and supply. So this area 1 was my consumer surplus. What is the change in consumer surplus? So initially it was 1, so we know that answer would be either A or B. Now if the government provides SG, so this is the quantity. This means that this entire area is not part of the consumer surplus. Area 5 is not part of the consumer surplus because we are not selling that many units. So everything to the left of the supply curve will become my consumer surplus. Because the prices are zero, so this area, and then it goes all the way up to the demand curve. So this entire area becomes my consumer surplus. So initially it was 1, now it is 1, 2 and 3. 1, 2, 3 and 4, right? So the answer becomes B. This is a technical concept. I hope you got most of them right. You had something to learn. Until next time, thank you.